No one in the parking lot behind Elmridge High School knew that the man who had just stepped out of the dark blue Dodge Charger had once led young soldiers through gunfire and scorching sands in Kandahar. They only saw a black man upright, seasoned in a Marine Corps dress uniform, pressed to perfection. But Marcus Reid hadn't come there to draw attention. He came because of a promise he had kept for 18 years. That afternoon, a light breeze swept through the fluttering flags atop the school building, carrying the arid warmth of a Texas summer. The lot was nearly complete. Children ran about, adults held balloons and student name boards. Everyone was bustling. Marcus turned off the engine and remained seated for a moment. This car had once belonged to his wife, Angela, the woman whose smile could make him forget the horrors of war. She had passed away 2 years ago from a sudden stroke, and since then every long drive on country roads felt like she was still there, sitting beside him. He opened the glove compartment and took out an old photograph, Angela holding Jalen, then just a toddler, his cheek nestled against her blouse while she smiled that kind of hopeful smile from someone who believed all the best things were still ahead. The photo's edges were slightly torn, its colors yellowed, but every detail was still vivid. Marcus gently folded the photo and tucked it into the left side of his jacket. "I promised Angie. I won't miss it." It wasn't a promise he was obligated to keep. It was the only thing left that made him feel like a husband, a father, the keeper of his family's flame. He stepped out of the car, his military shoes polished so thoroughly they reflected the sunlight not for show but because Marcus didn't know how to do things halfway. He adjusted his buttons, took a deep breath and walked toward the auditorium. His pace was neither hurried nor slow, but steady, as though every step had imprinted time and memory. To others, it was just a graduation ceremony. But to Marcus, it was a father's final march from an old battlefield to the audience row, where he would witness his son stepping across the threshold of life. No one in the crowd turned to recognize who he was, and he didn't need them to. He hadn't come for applause. He came to witness and to keep his word. And inside that scarred chest, behind the calm smile, was a heart quietly glowing with pride and slightly tightening with something unnameable, maybe longing, maybe faith, or both mingled into a feeling only those who have known loss and still love can truly understand. The auditorium door closed behind Marcus. The noise and scent of popcorn, floor wax, and old plastic chairs enveloped him. Inside the room was flooded with artificial light, rows of plastic chairs lined up like awaiting commands, and everywhere was the sound of Hope parents chatting. Students adjusting gowns, hurried hugs, firm handshakes. Marcus strolled, holding his ticket to a petite volunteer wearing a name tag, earbuds, and a clipboard. The man glanced at the ticket, nodded quickly, and pointed toward the third row on the left. "Families sit up front." "This way, sir." Marcus nodded his thanks, voice low, and even then followed the aisle between the seats. His eyes passed over the faces of parents, grandmothers, siblings, and people holding the same anticipation he did. The difference was in how they looked at him. Some turned away quickly, others glanced and whispered to those beside them. One woman smiled faintly but didn't hold his gaze longer than a breath. Marcus didn't react. He didn't need to. As a tall black man in a dress uniform walking through a mostly white crowd, he had long grown used to those looks, half inquisitive, half uneasy, from boardrooms to cafes, from military benches to bus stops. Not everyone was prejudiced, but most weren't ready to understand. He sat down. The plastic chair wobbled slightly, its metal frame clinking faintly, but he didn't complain. Before him was a faded red carpeted stage, a large silver-lettered banner hung on the wall, Class of 2024. Beneath the lights, school board members were shuffling papers, checking name order. At the auditorium's far end, a long line of students in black gowns was beginning to prepare their entrance. Marcus searched for his son. Jalen, tall and a bit lanky with his mother's eyes, stood somewhere among the group. 18 years had passed like a bullet through a trench. Marcus remembered the night the boy was born. He was still in uniform with dirt on his hands, and he was home from Okinawa on a 4-day leave. Now that boy was about to walk the stage. And Marcus, a man who had seen life and death on the battlefield, was now moved by an ordinary moment, watching his son grow up in a room full of strangers. Behind him, the noise carried on, like a busy river chairs, scraping programs, tearing someone laughing out loud, another dropping a coffee cup and muttering an apology. But all of it faded for Marcus. To him, there was no one else. No banner, no sound, only the stage, the children on the verge of adulthood, and the photo tucked against his heart, still there, pressing like a double heartbeat, one for a father and one for a son. He didn't take it out. He didn't need to look. Every line in that picture was etched deeper than memory. It was why he was sitting here, no matter how others looked at him. The graduation music began to swell, the familiar notes of pomp and circumstance, rippling through the air like a ceremonial wave, prompting the crowd to rise. Marcus stood 2 shoulders straight, arms at his sides. He didn't place a hand over his heart like the others. He didn't need to. His posture, eyes, and presence were the most respectful salutes he could offer. When the national anthem ended, he remained still, thinking of Angela, how she would have cried through the entire ceremony, and fixed Jalen's tie 3 times before leaving the house. A faint smile flickered. Then Marcus returned to stillness, but he didn't have time to sit before he sensed something was wrong. 2 men in black polo shirts and cargo pants, wearing earpieces and security belts, were approaching from the side aisle. They weren't police. The logo on their chests read Harlan Security Services, a private security firm. One was short, stocky, bald, with tense eyes. The other was taller, lean, chewing gum, with the annoyance of someone dragged off break. Marcus recognized them immediately, but didn't move. Military experience taught him that sometimes stillness holds more power than speech. He kept his eyes on the stage hands, lightly resting on his thighs, his expression calm and unmoved. The shorter guard, Travis Kent, leaned down slightly and spoke loudly. "Excuse me, sir. We need you to move." Marcus slowly turned his head, eyes calm. "Is there a problem?" the other guard, Brent O'Neill, said. "This seat is for the families of graduating students." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled out the ticket that had already been checked and held it out properly. Row 3, left side, family seating, valid ticket. Travis didn't bother looking at the paper. "We received word that this section is full." Marcus didn't move. "It was full. When I sat down, can you tell me who issued that order?" Brent began to feel uneasy. The man's voice was calm, almost disturbingly so. "It's nothing serious, sir. You can sit in the back. No need to make this into something bigger." Marcus's gaze narrowed, not in anger, but in consideration. "I drove 8 hours from Temple to see my son walk that stage. I'll be sitting right here." A few heads began to turn. A woman 2 rows ahead nudged her husband. Someone on the balcony tilted their phone subtly as if recording. Travis straightened, glancing around. "I'm going to have to ask you again, sir." Marcus didn't flinch. "You can ask all day." This time his voice was lower, firmer. Brent sighed quietly, chewing his gum harder. "You might be more comfortable in the back. That's all we're saying." And that's when the truth began to show. Marcus turned his head and looked at Brent for the first time. That sentence wasn't about seating. It wasn't about policy. It was something else. A stain from long ago that had followed him through hospital waiting rooms, bank lobbies, office gates, and military cafeterias, always wearing the face of a polite smile and a casual shrug. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. The air around them shifted, not obviously, but enough that many in the auditorium sensed it. Travis noticed it too. He adjusted his radio and touched his earpiece, but didn't take his eyes off Marcus, who sat still as if the conversation had ended. An elderly white woman beside Marcus leaned in and whispered, "Don't let them move you." Marcus didn't answer. He just gave a slight nod. He hadn't come here to cause trouble. He had come to be a father like any other father. But Travis and Brent weren't done yet. Brent leaned in further this time, almost at seat level. "If you have a concern, please take it to the school office after the ceremony. We're just following orders." Marcus turned back slowly, as if every movement carried weight. "What's your name?" Brent hesitated. "O'Neill. I'm a security officer." Marcus shook his head, voice steady. "No. You're not a cop. You're a private security contractor." Travis, frustrated, cut in, "That's enough. If you don't get up." He didn't finish the sentence, because at that very moment the auditorium doors swung open, and 6 men entered. None of them wore uniforms. None carried name tags. But the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. They didn't walk in all at once. They didn't jostle or speak. No one gave them commands. But each man, as if guided by the same instinct, entered the gym, like water seeping into sand quietly, surely, and irreversibly. The first through the door was a tall man with a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard, walking slowly but purposefully. A long black coat draped over a dark grey shirt, his shoes polished but not flashy. No one knew who he was, but those who'd survived heavy fire knew how to look. And in him they saw something no one on the security team recognized: the posture of a man who had once walked out of rubble by sheer will alone. It was Elijah Brooks, the man Marcus had dragged through gunfire in Kandahar, ignoring a hail of bullets like iron rain over the desert. Elijah didn't look around. He didn't need to. His eyes locked on one point, the 3rd row left side, where Marcus sat flanked by 2 guards who no longer seemed to realize they'd strayed out of character. Then came Damon Price, entering from the opposite side of the auditorium. A brown-skinned man, shaved head, gleaming eyes, sharp as freshly honed steel. He said nothing. He just sat in the aisle seat, arms folded, and his gaze fixed on Marcus. Next came Cole Turner, back straight like a masked face, calm and cold. Each step was like a boot print pressed into soft earth, leaving behind steel impressions. The 4th, 5th, and 6th followed like links in a chain. J. Thomas Lewis Vega and Nate Rivers took a strategic corner of the room, as if securing a battlefield. No one waved, no one called out. But all of them had seen Marcus, and Marcus didn't need to turn his head. He knew. Just reading the room, he knew the only unit he had ever trusted had arrived. And the strange thing that began to silence the audience was not that 6 men had appeared. It was that they didn't look at anyone else. They didn't explain. They didn't need to. Their presence was the message. They hadn't come for the graduation. They hadn't come by accident. They had come because one of their own, Marcus Reid, was being asked to vacate a legitimate seat for doing nothing more than what any father wished to do: watch his child graduate. Brent and Travis didn't understand what was happening. They were still standing, unaware that the silence in the auditorium was no longer inattentiveness, but a live wire waiting to snap. Marcus remained seated, unmoved, like a pillar, his eyes fixed on the stage. but inside him a switch had flipped. It wasn't rage, it wasn't fair. It activated an instinct that those who have survived hell carry in their blood, knowing when silence is a weapon, and when your brothers arrive without being called. The two guards began to hesitate. Some members of the audience had stopped looking at the stage. Their eyes turned toward Marcus. A few leaned in to whisper. Others quietly raised their phones to record. But Marcus didn't care about their stares. He didn't need anyone to defend him. He just needed his son to know that his father had never backed down and never would. Not in the Middle East jungles, nor a high school auditorium in Texas. The atmosphere now couldn't reasonably be called tense. It was a new kind of gravity. Those who had experienced real combat could feel it. No shouting, no threats. Just presence, and that presence alone made people adjust their breathing. That's when Marcus Reid lifted his head slightly, as if in gratitude, without saying a word or making a gesture. No one knew whom he was thanking, but if you looked closely, you'd see his eyes briefly meet Elijah's. And Elijah didn't nod or wave, just stood there like a living wall, silently blocking the wind behind you. Marcus Reid remained still as the room began to stir with hushed glances and loaded stances. But in his mind, the stage and rows of plastic chairs had started to fade. The applause, the names being called, all of it melted like a distant dream. Because Marcus's memory had pulled him somewhere else. A place with no microphone, no national anthem, no glittering class of 2024 banner. Kandahar, Afghanistan, 15 years ago. There was no gentle sunset that day. The sun struck the earth like a hammer of fire, turning the sand a rusted red, and making the air thick like molten steel. Marcus, then, a commanding sergeant, had just finished briefing his unit. The men were taking off helmets and sipping water when everything exploded. A sharp, cracking blast tore through the air, and an improvised explosive device IED had detonated beneath the lead Humvee. The vehicle flipped like a toy, shards of metal flying like blades. Then came the gunfire from 3 directions, not random, but organized. There was no time to think, no time to yell. Marcus rolled behind the remains of an armored door, raised his M4 and began scanning. Through the smoke and rising red dust, he saw 6 men. Trapped behind the burning vehicle, one of them was crawling out, dragging an unconscious body. Blood soaked the sand. That man was Elijah Brooks, then only 3 months into deployment. Shot in the leg, blood trickling from his temple, but still using both hands to drag his unconscious comrade Luis Vega away from the danger zone. Elijah looked up, locking eyes with Marcus, then croaked, "I thought you were hit." Marcus replied quietly, "You're observant." No orders were given. No reports filed. Marcus just ran. He sprinted through open ground filled with bullets and smoke to crawl beside them. He pulled Vega as Elijah pushed with one good leg. "Where's Divas?" Marcus shouted. Elijah pointed left toward the flipped vehicle, crushing someone beneath it. And then Marcus saw Nate Rivers, the youngest SEAL in the team, his leg pinned under a 1,000-pound engine block, fingers digging into the sand, trying to stay conscious as blood loss threatened to swallow him. Without a second thought, Marcus let go of Vega, turned and charged toward the wreck. Elijah shouted after him, "No, you can't," but Marcus didn't stop. He slipped on gravel and slammed his shoulder into the chassis, but bent down anyway, bracing himself, gripping the burning metal, and began to lift. The pain in his shoulder, his back, his ribs meant nothing compared to the screaming clock in his head. Hurry, hurry, hurry. The metal groaned, skin tore, but it shifted just enough for Nate Rivers to pull his leg free. He rolled out of the wreckage, gasping, neither of them knowing whose breath it was. They didn't celebrate. No one laughed. They crawled to the ridge, formed a defensive line, and held their ground until the medevac choppers arrived. Marcus was the last man off the battlefield that day. No complaints, no boastful stories, but from that moment, all 6 men understood they owed Marcus their lives, a standard of a man who left no one behind, even when no one told him to. From that day forward, there were no signatures, no oaths, only an unspoken truth. They would be there if Marcus Reid ever needed them, no matter where or what they were doing. Not to repay a debt, but to uphold what Marcus had taught them, stand up when no one else dares. And today, inside a small high school auditorium in Texas, they didn't need a call when they saw Marcus being disrespected by 2 hired guards. They didn't need a signal, they just needed to stand. And be there. Back in the present, the air in the auditorium had changed. Names were still being read. Applause still rippled. But the attention of the crowd had drifted away from the stage. It had converged on the 3rd row left side, where Marcus Reid still sat unmoving like a statue sculpted from resolve and lived history. The 2 guards were still standing beside him, but their earlier confidence had faded into barely hidden doubt. Though they didn't fully understand, they could feel they were now standing in something far greater than outsourced authority. Brent O'Neill chewed nervously one leg, tapping involuntarily. Travis Kent had touched his radio for the 3rd time, eyes scanning the room as if searching for backup he didn't know how to summon. They had never faced a situation like this, no yelling, no fighting, but every eye watching them, waiting for something to fall apart. "Listen," Travis said, trying to soften his tone. "We're just following orders, nothing personal. But if you don't cooperate, this ceremony could become a problem. Don't make this messy." Marcus turned his head toward him, not harshly or angrily, just like a teacher correcting a mistake. "You think I'm the problem," Travis exhaled. "We're just trying to help you avoid trouble." Marcus tilted his head, his voice dropping lower, each word like a calm blade slicing through artificial peace. "You don't have that authority, son." Everything around them paused for half a beat. Travis stepped back. Brent shifted sideways, clearly unsettled. But Travis, driven by embarrassment, still clung to control, or at least the illusion of it. "You think wearing that uniform makes you better than the rest of us? This is a school, not your military base." When those words left his mouth, the room shattered into complete silence. Not because anyone signaled, not because the mic failed, but because something deeper had just been touched. A child on their mother's lap stopped fidgeting. A father paused mid-photo. A teacher behind the stage stood slack-jawed. Even Brent Travis's partner leaned slightly and shook his head as if to say, "You just crossed the line." Marcus didn't blink. He breathed not to calm himself, but to hold his ground. "You need to walk away," he said calmly, like instructing a recruit. "Right now." But Travis didn't move. His hand dropped near his waist, not on a weapon, but close enough to signal a threat. And then, like a soundless tremor, one of the 6 men stepped forward. Elijah Brooks, whose posture was still straight like a command staff, slowly moved toward the central aisle. He didn't shout or gesture, but each step struck the minds of anyone who had known war. He stopped a row away from Marcus, voice resonating low, firm, clear. "If you touch him, you'll have to go through me first." Travis turned his head. "Who the hell are you to speak like that?" Elijah didn't move. "I'm the man who ends wrongs the moment they begin." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the auditorium. And then from across the room, Damon Price rose, eyes like ice. Next came Cole Turner, then Luis Vega, Jay Thomas, Nate Rivers. One by one, each man stood like a monument erected around Marcus, steady and unshakable. No one said anything more, but their presence was a force no one in the room, not even the administration, could ignore. There was no formation, no orders, but this was a formation of honor. No summons, no justification, just the knowledge of who they owed. Marcus still sat, but now he was no longer alone, and what the crowd remembered most that moment wasn't the next name read aloud. It was the silence. A silence weighed with reputation, loyalty, and blood-stained history. As Elijah took one more step forward, a ceiling light cast directly into his eyes. Not eyes of anger, but the eyes of someone who had once stared into the mouth of death, didn't flinch. In that instant, the entire gymnasium, including hundreds of parents, students, and teachers, understood this was no longer a minor conflict between a guest and security. This was a clash between honor and pettiness, between loyalty and false authority. On the other side of the auditorium, a school board member whispered something to the principal, who nodded immediately. The assistant principal, radio in hand, rose from her seat and moved quickly to the back, looking for a way to cool a storm without a name. But at the center of that storm, Marcus Reid still sat, hands on his knees, eyes on the stage. His posture hadn't changed, but everything else had. Travis Kent still refused to back down. He tightened his belt, his eyes darting, lips twitching with words unsaid, but swallowed. Beside him, Brent O'Neill stepped back, slightly, clearly understanding the moment no longer belonged to them. But Travis didn't know how to step back, or more accurately, his ego wouldn't let him. "This is your last warning," Travis said louder now, trying to drown out the silence pressing on the room. "You need to leave this seat, right now." Marcus didn't move. "Leave." For what? Travis leaned down, voice sharp, close enough for everyone nearby to see his hand drop toward his hip. Not on a weapon, but close enough for everyone to feel the threat. "Leave, so this doesn't turn into something worse. So no one gets hurt over a seat." And at that moment, Marcus didn't reply. He didn't have to. Because once again, it wasn't he who spoke. It was those who had once been pulled from the edge of death by his hands. This time, once buried beneath rubble in Al-Anbar, Damon Price stepped fully into the aisle, placing himself between Marcus and Travis. He didn't touch anyone. He just spoke loud enough for Travis to hear. And for the entire auditorium to hear, "You said this seat isn't worth someone getting hurt. Then you should be the one to step back first." Now he understood. Not just understood. He felt it. Jalen's name was about to be called. The assistant principal gently tapped his shoulder, but the boy barely registered it. His mind was filled with the image: 6 men, not in uniform, not holding weapons, standing like sentinels around a silent father in a gymnasium. No introductions, no explanations, just a look exchanged, and that was enough. The announcer paused, cleared her throat, and adjusted the mic. Then her voice rang out slower than the names before, as though carrying some hidden weight: "Jalen Reid." And in that moment, the room paused for half a beat. No cheers, no whistles, just one sound. A unified rhythm from 6 different corners of the auditorium. 6 veterans raised their hands and began to clap. It was not the wild applause typical of graduations, but a strong, deliberate cadence, even like a silent military march. Then the row near Marcus joined in. A few parents stood. A few teachers teared up. Those who had stayed silent now clapped louder, not because a boy's name was called, but because they had witnessed something rare, a silence more powerful than noise. Jalen stepped onto the stage. His gown billowed lightly with each step. He didn't rush. He didn't tremble. He walked the way his father sat, steadfast, humble, unbowed. He shook the principal's hand, received his diploma, and turned to find one person among the crowd. Marcus didn't rise. He didn't need to. Just a soft smile, barely visible, seen only by Jalen. Jalen nodded, not a dramatic nod, but one that in that moment bridged two generations in a way no words ever could. Under the stage, the applause hadn't faded. No one signaled, and no one needed to. Those who witnessed it knew that this wasn't just a graduation ceremony. It was an event in which a father did not stand, but an entire room rose for him. The gym gradually cooled as the ceremony wrapped up, but everyone who had sat there knew they wouldn't forget that afternoon. As graduation caps flew into the air, cheers echoed across seats, quick hugs and candid photos marked the end of a chapter, and Marcus Reid still sat in the third row on the left. He didn't rush to rise, didn't blend into the crowd. He let himself sit in the noise like a soldier who once learned to hear the silence between gunfire, now listening to the quiet respect amidst celebration. As the crowd thinned, Elijah Brooks approached. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at Marcus, then glanced at the emergency exit where Travis and Brent had vanished long ago. "You all right?" Elijah asked, as if the answer didn't matter. Marcus nodded with a thin but genuine smile. "I've survived worse." Elijah chuckled, tilting his head. "Yeah, but this never should have happened." From behind, Damon Price and Luis Vega stepped forward. They didn't interrupt. They stood there as they once stood behind Marcus years ago, awaiting orders or ensuring the man who once risked his life for them would never again stand alone. "We tried to keep it low," Luis said. "Didn't want to make noise." But when he reached for his belt, Marcus raised a hand, gently cutting him off. "You did the right thing. You stood up at the right moment. Not a second too early, not a second too late." The three men nodded, not to affirm, but to show thanks that someone like Marcus still existed. Marcus rose slowly. His 60-year-old body no longer moved with the speed of youth, but his posture was never bowed. Not once. Outside, the late afternoon sun lit up the parking lot. Voices rang, bottles cracked open, and students rushed to hug their mothers. And near the flagpole, amid clusters of students taking selfies, Jalen Reid stood still, gown off, diploma in hand, scanning the crowd for one familiar figure. When he spotted his father, everything else faded. He stopped talking and walked toward him, unhurried, unwavering. They met in the middle of the courtyard, no running cinematic embrace or dramatic backpatting. Just eyes meeting and the unspoken truth that both had just crossed a milestone no one else could truly understand. "You all right, Dad?" Jalen asked quietly. Marcus nodded. "You," Jalen clutched the diploma tighter. "They tried to throw you out, in front of everyone." I was ready to walk out when his hand touched that strap. Marcus placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his gaze not angry, just deep. "And it's because you were ready that you didn't have to." Jalen frowned. "I don't get it." Marcus gently squeezed his shoulder. "Because you knew I could stand on my own. And because you understood. Today was your day, not theirs. If you had gotten angry, if you had left, you would have handed them the right to define this day. But you didn't. You held on to this moment the way only someone with real strength can." Jalen lowered his head as if those words didn't just reach his ears, but dropped into something deeper within, that he had never named. Then he asked the men who stood up today, "Who are they?" Marcus turned his head. Those 6 men were still near the exit. They weren't waiting for thanks. They just stood there quietly chatting, eyes occasionally drifting back toward Marcus, as if instinct hadn't faded even after all these years. "They're the men I once bled with," Marcus said. "And they're the ones who will never forget who kept them alive to come home. You see, true loyalty doesn't need a call. It just needs to be there when it counts." Jalen looked over, realizing for the first time that the scars and fragments of stories his father had once shared in bits and pieces now had form. They had stepped out of memory into reality and were standing in a living line before him. "I want to be like you," he said softly, without trembling. Marcus smiled gently. "You already are. You didn't walk away. You didn't let anger steal your moment. You stood when everything around you tried to make you fall." They stood there for a moment, shoulder to shoulder. No more words were needed. Because what had just been passed on was not a lecture or a slogan, but something far more profound, communicated through action and silence. And in the distance, 6 men, none armed, stood like they had never left the battlefield. For them, the battlefield never ends, it only changes the scenery. And those worth protecting never have to ask. The sun had tilted westward, casting long streaks of light across the schoolyard, as if time was stepping back gently, letting the final moment belong to father and son. Marcus and Jalen walked toward the parking lot, quietly threading their way through the laughter, the excited calls and the flurry of flower bouquets being passed around. No one noticed them. Perhaps that was the most memorable part of the day, when no one is watching people show their most authentic selves. Angela's old Dodge Charger was still parked there, silent, like an extension of memory. Marcus opened the door while Jalen circled his hand lightly, brushing the old scratch near the handle, a small scar on a car that had carried their family for years. "Mom would have screamed with joy today," he said, half smiling, half choked. Marcus tilted his head, a soft grin under the golden light. "And she would have made us retake graduation photos. At least 3 times until I smiled the right way." They both got in and shut the doors. The outside noise was instantly sealed off, leaving a cabin filled with quiet, warm, intimate, scented with old leather road dust and a kind of familial bond that had never broken. Jalen turned to his father. "I still don't get it. You could have stood up, could have reacted. Why did you choose to stay still?" Marcus didn't respond right away. He looked straight ahead, his hands resting on the wheel, then gently tapped a small crack on the dashboard as if touching something deeper. "Because I don't need to stand to prove I deserve respect," he said slowly. "And I don't need to shout to be heard." Jalen was silent. He was listening not with his ears, but with everything he had just witnessed. Marcus continued, "You know, I've had hundreds of chances to react angrily, and there were times I did. But the older I got, the more I realized. Timely silence weighs more than a speech. The right posture in the right place can change how the world sees a person." Jalen leaned back into the seat, his eyes drifting toward the window where classmates were leaping into photos, tossing flowers, chasing one another. They were still in their world, where growing up hadn't taught them that the most accurate test of character might be how you hold yourself when no one's watching. Your mother and you, your picture. "I carry it with me," Marcus said, pulling the old photo from the inside of his coat. "Not for strength, but to remind me what's worth protecting. Who do I live for, and why, even sitting alone in a crowded room, I've never felt alone." Jalen looked at the photo. The child's eyes, his own, once rested innocently on his mother's shoulder. Now he sat beside his father, not as a boy needing protection, but as a young man who had just learned the most important lesson of his life. Silence is not weakness. Not reacting doesn't mean you've lost. Some people only need to sit still, and the world will adjust its behavior around them. "So, what now?" Jalen asked, like a gentle period at the end of a chapter. Marcus smiled. "Now we go home, and you get to choose dinner." "Waffle House," Jalen replied instantly. Marcus laughed. "Of course. How could it not be Waffle House?" The Charger slowly rolled out of the lot. The school faded behind them. But for the 2 men inside, the day hadn't ended. It had only just begun. This wasn't just graduation day for Jalen. It was the day he understood maturity doesn't start when you receive a diploma. It begins when you can hold your ground even when no one is watching. Some people have to scream to be noticed, but some only need to sit still and will never be forgotten.